Hey, welcome to Film Fanatics, three film geeks discussing movies new and old. My name is Dan.
My name is Justin.
And I'm Joe.
This week, our new releases include an all-star cast in Ridley Scott's The Counselor and the latest film from the Jackass crew, Bad Grandpa. Our new classic this week is Margin Call, starring Kevin Spacey. Our old classic is the wilderness comedy Without a Paddle, and our Oscar nominee A to Z film is the trippy 2002 Nicolas Cage film, Adaptation. Our top five this week, inspired by Without a Paddle, is our favorite adventure comedies. Before we get started, though, I do want to point out an error I made on last week's show. In my review for Carrie, I mentioned that I thought Julianne Moore was doing her best Sissy Spacek impression. Now, I've only watched the 70s version of Carrie one time, and it was about 24 hours before we did the podcast, and I was really watching for more content-related things as opposed to the specifics of the actors. Long story short, it was Piper Laurie who played Carrie's mom in the original film. Sissy Spacek played Carrie herself. So it is Laurie that Julianne Moore seems to be imitating in the new version of the film. But that aside, let's get to our new releases for this week, and we start with the week's number one film, making over $32 million in its opening weekend at the box office, and that is Bad Grandpa. Joe, why don't you tell us about that?
Bad Grandpa. Now, this is an interesting little film. Johnny Knoxville plays an elderly gentleman who, after losing his wife of 46 years, decides that he is free and can go on a series of various pranks and sexual debauchery. However, after reuniting with his daughter very briefly, he finds that he has a young grandson who, due to his daughter going to prison for some sort of drug charges, he finds himself with this young boy and decides that because he doesn't want to do anything with him, he's going to take him across the country to get to his father. Many pranks ensue, and over time, these two characters begin to bond, and it's sort of a cute little story. Bad Grandpa is something really different from the Jackass crew. It's not quite as gross as some of their previous works, oddly enough, and I would argue that it's not quite as funny. Admittedly, the Jackass films are kind of hit and miss for me. Some skits really work, some pranks work, and some really don't. But this is something really different, and I have to kind of applaud it for that. Johnny Knoxville is really trying to tell an honestly kind of down-to-earth story I think might come from some personal experiences he's had. That is actually something really different. I thought Knoxville did okay, and I did kind of like the makeup work. Once again, that's pretty impressive, I think more so than the previous films. And the young kid actor does have a few good laughs as well. And they have pretty decent chemistry. However, I think that's probably the best thing that the film has going for it. Other than that, I just think it's kind of more of the hit-and-miss humor that you had in the previous Jackass films. Overall, though, I do think it had a decent narrative, and I'm going to leave Bad Grandpa with a C.
Justin?
I have to give the Jackass team a little credit for doing something a little bit above their normal, quote, movies that are basically 90-minute episodes. There is an actual narrative here, albeit most of it seems kind of phoned in and mostly an excuse to do what the Jackass team does best, pranks. That said, grading a Jackass-related film ultimately comes down to, were they actually funny despite literally throwing everything at the screen and hoping something works? For about the first 20 minutes, I was really not a fan of this movie, but as it went along, there were a couple things that I found relatively funny. I still don't think Johnny Knoxville's character of Irving Zisman can, or should for that matter, carry an entire movie, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I snickered at some of the interplay between his character and the child actor who plays Billy, who I would easily argue ends up stealing the show, particularly in his individual pranks. It's not really a step up, or down for that matter, from anything Jackass has already done, but it is something slightly different that has a couple mildly amusing moments for me. Bad Grandpa gets a C-.
I'm not a Jackass fan. I find the whole concept to be kind of gross and stupid and juvenile. However, I like movies where, sort of like Borat, where a character is pranking unsuspecting victims, and usually the hilarity comes from the victim's reactions. So I was hopeful for Bad Grandpa based on its trailers, and I wasn't entirely disappointed, but I wish there was a little bit more to the movie. Many of the hidden camera scenes played very well and landed hilariously with an extremely game Knoxville and precocious Jackson Nickel, the name of the kid. He was the only bright spot in last year's Fun Size, in which the two also worked together. The loose plot surrounding the gags is, for me, where the film lost its footing. I thought having a story to sort of connect everything together was a good idea, But between pranks and gags, you have 3 or 4 minutes where the movie basically slows to a halt. When all of the humor in the movie comes from the reactions of the people being pranked, nary a snicker is to be found when it's just the two of them, and for me that really dragged the movie down. However, in the 4 or 5 best pranks pulled in the movie, I was laughing so hard I was in or near tears. So for that, I do have to give Bad Grandpa a positive grade, and I leave it with a B-.
Ooh.
Joe, what was your favorite prank that they pulled in the movie?
The one that really worked best for me was when he kept trying to go out to different strip clubs and he couldn't get in. And then later on, when he went to the one strip club where it was just, for the ladies only.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the male review.
He didn't realize that it was going to be a bunch of male strippers, that he decided to go walk, and then his fake testicles came.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I just, for some reason, that one was really good. I think other than that, I liked some of the kids' comments. Like just how he nonchalantly talks about his mom doing drugs and then going immediately to liking chocolate milk, and people just being completely aghast, like they don't know how to react. So, I mean, as you can tell, I did think about it. It was pretty funny.
Yeah.
What about you?
I have to say that my favorite was probably the capper to it all, which we saw in the previews a little bit, where Johnny Knoxville brings the kid to a beauty pageant for kids, like the toddlers and tiaras kind of crowd, and has him do this like little stripper routine.
Well, that actually was really funny. The reason that one I didn't really reserve for me is because I kind of always find those pageants a little weird. So I was kind of... They're
hideous, and that's why I loved
him kind of making fun of that?
Making fun of it, and making fun of the parents doing it. Mm-hmm. And the best part of that whole scene for me was that the one mother watching seemed completely unfazed by the whole thing.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Some of the mothers were recoiling in horror, and the kids and stuff.
Some were smiling.
And there was, like, one mother specifically was just... She was, like, looking at it as if, okay, yep, this is...
different.
I'm getting ideas from my own daughter for next year's pageant.
I liked the one shot of the lady, like, starting to clap, like, oh, wait, I wasn't supposed to
Yeah, at the end they said, let's give her a hand. And the one woman claps one time. Justin, what was your favorite prank in Bad Grandpa?
I would have to say it's about around the midway point of the movie, where Jackson Nickel, I believe he said his name was, he comes up to this guy in, like, his mid-30s, I guess, and is trying to ask if he'll be his new dad.
Oh, I felt so bad for that guy because he was so nice, too.
And the way he just keeps playing it off, I just was truly rolling before that ended.
He's a pretty good improver, that kid, because he didn't really break character. I mean, I'm sure they probably shot a lot of footage where maybe he did break character or the target wasn't quite as enthusiastic, but in the scenes in the film, he was pretty good.
I actually agree with what Justin said. I think the kid did steal the show towards the end. He was getting really good.
Yeah.
He was a pretty good actor. He didn't break character at all. I guess one thing that was weird about the movie that you kind of brought up was that the whole film was trying to have a narrative. So on one hand, you kind of took it as a movie. However, some of the instances for the context of the different pranks seem set up purely for pranks. And that's kind of where it's weird. It's like the movie kind of breaks character a bit. Right. So you're not entirely sure whether it's pranks or it's supposed to be a movie that just has this old guy pulling ridiculous pranks on people.
Well, and it's supposed to have this sort of heart to it towards the end of the film, and I don't know, I just sort of liked the prank part of it.
Well, to be honest, I thought that, like we said, I think that them trying to have a narrative was good. As I said, I liked the message of the movie. I thought it was nice, though admittedly because of what the film is, it is a little too silly that it doesn't fully register.
Yeah, like I said in my review, I appreciate that they tried to have a narrative to put it all together, so it wasn't like a Jackass movie where, like Justin said, it was basically like an extended episode.
But you gave you gave it a high rating because you liked the pranks.
Yeah, I mean, pranks alone, the movie would score even higher. I mean, I laughed very, very hard at some of those pranks. I think Johnny Knoxville's a funny guy. I don't like the Jackass stuff when they hurt each other. I don't think that's funny. But I think Knoxville himself is funny. And I think he's certainly very creative. And you definitely hit the nail on the head with the makeup. For those that don't know, it took 3 hours each day of shooting to put him in the makeup. And for scenes where Irving wasn't wearing a shirt, it took 5 hours. In just makeup, and then you have to do the pranks all day. And, so I can appreciate all the work that went into it.
Well, would you say that Johnny Knoxville's a decent actor? Because I don't know how much range he really has, but to be honest, in this movie, I mean, admittedly, for as goofy as it was, I thought he did a pretty good job with what he was trying to do.
Well, I don't know that I would say Johnny Knoxville is a good actor, but I think he's certainly a good comedian, or maybe good comedic actor.
Improver, perhaps.
Yeah, certainly a good improver. Justin, what do you think?
I think he fits the bill more as a comedian than an actual, like, comedy actor. He definitely sells the idea, his character, albeit, like I said in my review, I don't think there should have been an entire movie devoted to this character. But I do agree with you. I think he's got a lot of improv talent. Mm-hmm. I wish he would branch out and actually play off this more in future films in terms of narrative, but not necessarily with this character. So
that's also, I think, why I might have given it a slightly higher grade than you guys. Because I personally do like the character a lot. I think he is akin to like a Borat or a Bruno, where I enjoyed, like, I didn't get tired of him or his antics. I just thought it was a little bit slow in the periods where they weren't doing a prank.
To be honest, I don't think the character was bad. I just think they needed to build on the narrative because it was a very loose one. If they had actually had set up more instances to kind of build upon the story of like these actual relationships between these different characters and kind of like focus like a little more on the dad, a little more on the mom, it could have been a funnier movie or at least a stronger movie narratively.
Right.
And I think that's honestly where it kind of falls. So I don't know if it's necessarily the character because I was fine with the character.
All right, well, let's move on here. Up next, we've got The Counselor, and Justin's going to tell us about that.
All right, so The Counselor is about a greedy lawyer, known only as The Counselor, who decides he wants to dive into the world of drug trafficking with the encouragement of an entrepreneur and drug kingpin named Reiner, played by Javier Bardem. Despite the caution of a fellow business associate named Westray, played by Brad Pitt, the counselor decides to dig deeper into this, unaware of the consequences that may soon befall him and those he cares about. Now, the world of Cormac McCarthy, who wrote the script, is fairly dark and bleak and bound to really divide audiences. No Country for Old Men and The Road stand as probably the best examples of adaptations of his work that emphasize this, but still present the overall themes of both stories in a unique and an occasionally poignant way. But this is the biggest issue that The Counselor has. It doesn't really have one. And if there is one, the only real point that it could possibly have is that greed corrupts all. And unfortunately, that's a theme that has long since gone stale. The film veers off in several odd and sometimes even misogynistic ways. And for much of the narrative, it's difficult to figure out what exactly is happening, both physically and possibly even symbolically. That said, the film does benefit from subtlety, particularly during the tension-filled conversations between Fassbender and Pitt, who continues to prove my point that he is significantly better as a supporting actor. All in all, The Counselor may be sound and fury signifying nothing, but it does have a few good moments that prevent it from being a complete and utter disaster. Ridley Scott, better luck next time, my friend. The Counselor gets a C.
I think that is quite high. I'm still not completely sure what even happened in this movie. The plot was such a mess. The script from Cormac McCarthy was completely muddled. Other than a few good turns by pros Javier Bardem, Brad Pitt, Rosie Perez, and Michael Fassbender, I didn't really see much good about this film at all. I thought there were so many pointless scenes that had nothing to do with anything that could have been excised in favor of some further explanation about other things in the film. Cameron Diaz continues to prove that the only thing she does well is comedy, and Penelope Cruz, already someone I don't really care for, is basically sleepwalking through her role. There's far too much talking in the film, yet it's so convoluted that very little ever gets explained, and then Cameron Diaz has sex with a car. I just can't give it any higher than a D. Joe?
I don't know. My experience with this film was very interesting because I thought that it looked interesting. I thought it might have been a decent film. I went in, and I will admit, throughout most of the film, I was very interested in what was going on. I wanted to follow what was going on. I wanted to see where things were leading. And I thought that despite all the really intricate, kind of vague, philosophical conversations these characters have, maybe there would be some interlaying plot that would be explained and everything would be tied together. And maybe both on, the literal level and the metaphorical level might make some sense and have some revelation.
Wouldn't that have been nice?
That would have been great. But as the movie continued, I began to grow more and more frustrated. Every time another conversation would start, I'm like, why don't you just say what is going on? Like, it was nobody talks this way. It just got worse and worse. And the ending of this film it was just incredibly frustrating. The characters are all basically unlikable, and the most likable characters get completely screwed over. Michael Fassbender does an excellent job, and I will admit what you guys said is true. The acting is really good in this film, and the dialogue is really good in this film. There are some great conversations, but that's all this film really is. It's great actors speaking these great conversations. They're very well written, but the actual narrative seems to be barely there, and if it is there, nobody's explaining it. And another really frustrating part about the film for me was that the main character, the counselor, is supposed to be the focus of the film, and the film is called The Counselor, and yet it feels like the film's not really about the counselor, or any of his involvement with what's going on is never crucially explained. So we never understand how he was even really involved in the transaction that was going on. I never really got a sense of it. I didn't know who was connected to who. Honestly, there was no real crucial fact that anything was really going on other than some hearsay and some conversations. And I just wanted the counselor to do something by the end of the film.
Sometimes you don't even know who the conversations are with. People are on the phone, and you never know who's on the other end of it.
No, it's true.
Or what they say.
It's true. They'll be like Cameron Diaz was talking to somebody. We don't know who she was talking to. Maybe the guy at the end of the film, but we don't know. We have no hint of possibility of that. I don't know. It's a frustrating film to talk about, and it might sound like I'm really, really angry about it because I am, but I thought the performances were really good. I thought the dialogue was really good. And there was some great cinematography, and there was some genuine suspense, particularly with wires. Several wire scenes really got me. And I liked some of the ideas that this film was trying to explore. However, because the narrative is virtually non-existent, the characters are pretty much unlikable, and really it just becomes frustrating what happens throughout the third act of the film, the counselor gets a C-.
That's higher praise than I thought.
It's because
actually.
It's because I really liked the performances. And I like the dialogue, and I like the themes.
The performances are the only thing holding this movie afloat, I think.
And maybe they just really connected with me on that level really well. I like I said, I liked the conversations. I liked this film was trying to have layers. It was trying to explore something. I'm just not entirely sure what it was.
Somebody said to me about the movie that they thought it was super long, and I didn't find that it was too long. I really didn't. And that's why I say that there were plenty of scenes that were useless that they could have gotten rid of and replaced with scenes that sort of tied something together. I would have been fine with the exact same runtime. I didn't think it was too slow. But it was just, like you say, the narrative didn't exist. And I would have rather... There's a scene towards the end of the movie with John Leguizamo. And I like John Leguizamo, but that scene and his character and the characters that he was talking to
superfluous
were completely unnecessary, pointless. Superfluous is a great word. I love that you said it.
If I had to describe the film one word, I'd say a lot of superfluous is the word.
You take out a scene like that, which was probably, 4 minutes, let's say, and you add in something else that could help us figure out what is going on.
You could have showed Rosie Perez talking, okay, like, I think he killed my son. We'll go after him. Why? Well, because he did this with this guy.
Right.
Therefore, and that's all we would have needed. Like, honestly, I was talking to a coworker of ours, and he brought up a good point. If this film had, 10 solid minutes of explaining exactly what was connected to who, it could have been exactly the same, and it would have been a decent film.
And there's easily 10 minutes that could have been taken out. The scene with Cameron Diaz having sex with a car, I guess it was for some sort of...
Honestly,
comedic effect.
Honestly, that's one of the things that I loved and hated about the film, is that scene's a good example. This interesting conversation about something kind of speaks to some ideas about sexuality and womanhood and shallow debauchery and whatnot, kind of the themes of the film. So I get that, but in terms of what it had to do with the plot, Javier Bardem's character even says, I don't even know why I told you that.
Right.
So it's like, okay, so basically the actors don't even know why they're reading these lines.
At the end of the story, he does say something to the effect of, I don't even know what's happening.
Basically, he just goes, Michael, actually, that entire scene was pointless. It doesn't really add anything to the story at all. It just proves that Cameron Diaz is weird.
Can we agree, though, that Javier Bardem is one of the coolest guys? Right?
If they could just make a spin-off film about what happened before this, just following his character, that'd be great.
For those that don't know me personally... I have spiky hair. I've carried spiky hair for about a decade. And his hair in this movie, he's the only 40-something-year-old actor that could pull off anything like that. And he makes it cool.
He's a great actor.
He is a great actor.
And I liked it. It's it's like I said, once again, it's the only thing holding it up for me, really. It did a good job with the material they were given.
It really is the only thing for me is the performances keeping it from an F.
There were some other things that really kind of added on to that. I think were compounded by the performances. But what was there, I think, was kind of flimsy. And I will admit, I like big ideas. I like atmosphere and tone. And this movie had that in abundance. I liked it stylistically. But you can't deny the fact that narratively it's
Disjointed.
It's beyond sloppy.
Yeah.
I mean,
disjointed is a compliment.
That disjointed,
honestly,
like we said, if they just had that's what's frustrating. There's 5 to 10 crucial minutes that we need to see.
Yeah.
And who knows? It might have been a C or a B.
Yeah.
Honestly,
absolutely. I wasn't bored with it.
No, it was.
I just didn't know what was happening.
I'll be honest. This might sound weird because I gave Bad Grandpa a slightly higher grade. I admit I was more entertained by The Counselor.
Is that right?
I was.
Well, and even though I don't really care for Bad Grandpa's narrative story, at least I could tell you what it was and what was happening.
One of the things that struck me as interesting prior to this being released was the fact that people who read the script really did like it, but noted that it was significantly longer than the film's actual running time. A page of script usually accounts to about a minute of running time. For anyone who isn't familiar with Ridley Scott, the man is notorious for his director's cuts of films that were released that sometimes get mixed to negative reception on the first go, and often work in their favor. So, if there ever does end up being a director's cut of some sort with this that is longer, I would be very curious to see if that does end up changing the grade for this film in the end game, but obviously that's going to be a couple of months, if not years away from this point in time.
But I do agree that if a director's cut were to surface with, say, an extra 20 minutes of film or something, I mean, it still wouldn't be a great grade for me because all that other stuff that doesn't need to be there would still be in it. But if it could tie it together somehow with a director's cut with some extra footage, I would definitely think I would give it a higher grade. All right, well, let's move on here. We've got The Fifth Estate now, and this is a biopic of Julian Assange, the creator of WikiLeaks, which landed him in some hot water internationally with all of its news sources that they were sort of covering up. And for me, this just didn't look interesting to begin with, and it did not disappoint in that department. Other than Benedict Cumberbatch's performance as Julian Assange, there just isn't much good at all about this film. Even Daniel Bruhl, who plays Assange's right-hand man, who was so good in Rush last month, flounders here. During the first 45 minutes or so, I was debating whether I might give it a D or even a D+ in spots, but that all fell apart for me once they introduced characters that don't exist in the real world, played by Stanley Tucci, Laura Linney, and Anthony Mackie, specifically as part of President Obama's staff. If you're going to have a biographical film, you might want to make all the people in it actually exist. The analogy I made to Justin as we were watching the film is that it would be like in Ray if instead of Ray Charles' actual wife, they just made someone up and said, this is his wife. It's especially ironic that in a film about someone who wants to expose the truth, they make people up. I don't care about WikiLeaks, and I especially don't care about Julian Assange, and this film did nothing to change my mind about either, and The Fifth Estate gets an F from me. Justin?
Alright, so let me start off by saying, much like The Counselor, every great film needs a compelling narrative. If there isn't that, the end result is basically a waste of time. This is the fate that befalls The Fifth Estate, a film that seems to have no idea what exactly it wants to do. From the very beginning, the audience gets left with innumerous questions about the character of Julian Assange, the most prominent of which that stuck out to Dan and I while watching it was, how on earth is Assange actually getting paid for all of this?
Oh my god, I asked you the question. We saw the movie in the theater by ourselves, so we were able to talk during it, thankfully. And I must have said to you 4 or 5 times, where is this guy getting any of his money from?
And these questions never end up getting answered. It then goes from being a story of rebellion in online media to a disjointed mess that leaves character development out to dry and even more awkward unanswered questions, culminating in an ending that I can only describe as obnoxiously preachy. The only thing saving this from being an F comes from the lead actors Benedict Cumberbatch and Daniel Bruhl, who truly do everything within their power to make the best of what they have. It barely keeps the film afloat, but I will give credit where credit is due. The Fifth Estate barely scrapes away with a D.
See, for me, one solid performance just is not enough to keep it out of an F. And I don't think that Cumberbatch was so beyond great in this that it would bring it up to that D for me. You know, the counselor, like, I named off a few people that I thought gave really good performances. To be honest, I didn't think Daniel Bruhl was all that great in this. But you're right, they just glossed over so many things. At one point, Assange and Daniel Bruhl's character have this big fight, and he says, well, you know, you're out of WikiLeaks or whatever they said. And then in the next scene, they're collaborating on something, and both of us looked at each other and were like, when did they make up? Like, what just happened? It never explained that once, much like the whole where does he get his money from. And to me, just that one good performance, and from interviews I've seen with Assange and everything, it is a good performance, but just it's not enough to save the film. All right, we're going to close our new release portion of the show with Romeo and Juliet, and here relative unknown Douglas Booth and True Grit's Haley Steinfeld portray the titular characters here in the latest adaptation of The Greatest Love Story Ever Told, directed this time by Carlo Carle. Though it's a bit uncomfortable watching the 14-year-old Steinfeld discuss making love and getting married to her Romeo, there isn't really that much inherently wrong with the film. It's more of a question of it being completely unnecessary. When we talked about Carrie in last week's episode, we mentioned that the nearly 40-year-old original film did need a bit of a facelift, but whereas that remake at least updated the technology and special effects, this version of Romeo and Juliet not only brings nothing new to the table, but the leads aren't particularly filled with chemistry either. Other than Paul Giamatti's fantastic turn as Friar Lawrence here, there's literally no reason to see this film if you've seen any other adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. It still takes place in Renaissance Verona, and though some of the traditional dialogue is changed a bit, it's not like Juliet is texting "Wherefore art thou, Romeo" to him. Say what you will about Baz Luhrmann's Leonardo DiCaprio-led version in the 90s, at least there were a few twists added. This version is just bland and not creative in any way, and it gets a C- from me. Enough said about that. We move on now to our top 5, and this week we saw Without a Paddle for our old classic, and so we thought we would name off our top 5 adventure comedies. And I do want to mention that as we sort of came up with the idea, we tossed around, you know, maybe a dozen or so titles that would fit the bill, because we wanted to be sure we were sort of all on the same page. There's definitely a difference between an action comedy, like a Beverly Hills Cop or Lethal Weapon or The Heat, than there is adventure comedy. So these are mostly movies where the main characters maybe travel far from home, maybe go backwards and forwards in time in some instances. And so we're going to start off with Joe for this, and he's going to tell us his 5 through 2.
All right. You'll probably recognize some of these. My number 5 is Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Nice.
It's probably one of Keanu Reeves' few really good performances, and it's just a really fun, heartfelt, silly comedy that deals with time travel. And being a history buff, it's really fun to see all these different historical figures interact with these 90s surfer wannabe rockers and just kind of interacting with modern settings, that being late 80s, early 90s California. Mm-hmm. But it's just a really fun and kind of witty movie. I mean, I love George Carlin, probably one of the greatest side characters ever. And
yeah, he's so good as Rufus.
He's great. I mean, you know, once again, it's fun, it's heartfelt, it's just an enjoyable film. And I admit I didn't grow up with it. I saw it probably when I was a teenager at some point. I heard about it, I thought, you know, this movie looks just so silly. And it is silly, but it's just so endearing, and I like that. And I also like the sequel, too.
And it's funny, by that point, Keanu Reeves was a star. Like, by the time you would have seen the film.
Oh, I was used to seeing him in things like The Matrix and Constantine. I kind of knew him as more of a serious actor, so to speak. So going back and seeing him so young doing something so comedic, I was like, wow. I mean, I don't hate him as much as some people do, but he actually did pretty good in that movie.
Yeah, and for me, I saw it when it was originally out, and it was the first time I had ever heard of Keanu Reeves, and I thought he was hysterical.
Who's the gentleman that played Bill?
Alex Winter.
I like him, too.
I liked him as well.
What happened to him?
I am not sure.
Because He was great. I mean, why did Ted get all the love? You know, I don't understand that. But Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and as noted, sequel, I believe, of Bogus Journey,
Yep.
I actually enjoy as well. My number 4 is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This one is, pretty much a classic adventure comedy full of that Monty Python dry English wit that I enjoy so much. And honestly, you quote these scenes all the time. I heard this all the time growing up in school. Everybody loved this movie, and I watched it many times. And honestly, when people say that it's probably the most entertaining Monty Python film, I really think that it is. I do enjoy some of their other ones, but this one was really, really good. I can watch it anytime. Number 3 will make Dan very happy. It is Back to the Future.
Yeah.
If you wanted me to include all 3, I would, since it's basically one big narrative. But the first one probably would be my favorite adventure comedy, because I don't think it deviates too much from the primary theme of the movie, and it doesn't go too dark. It's just really fun, really smart, a lot of great performances. I love Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd. It's so witty, so enjoyable. Enough said. And my number 2 is Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. As you guys know, I'm a big Star Trek fan, and this is honestly one of the best movies, and it's the only time in which Star Trek takes an outing to pure comedy on, feature film. And directed by Leonard Nimoy, it's really, really good.
It really works.
It's really good, and it's kind of funny that it hasn't been done too much. Usually Trek tries to stay relatively serious, but this film really, really worked, and it's goofy, and it knows it, and it plays with it, and the performances are really on point here. It's really awesome. It really is one of the best Trek films, for sure, and it's sitting pretty comfortably at number 2.
To answer your question about Alex Winter, he has moved on from the acting for the most part. Throughout the 90s, he directed a bunch of music videos, including clips for Red Hot Chili Peppers and Helmet.
Cool.
And lately, he's been directing Ben 10 movies for the Cartoon Network. He's done 2 TV films about Ben 10.
Well, I do like the Chili Peppers and Helmet, and I did watch Ben 10 a little bit, so that's actually pretty cool. He's doing some artistic contributions.
So he's still in the entertainment biz.
Awesome.
Justin, what about your list?
Okay. Number 5 for me was The Gods Must Be Crazy.
I knew you were going to say that.
Oh, I've never seen that.
You've seen it?
I have. I had a feeling that was going to come up on someone's list. Good choice.
For anybody who's unfamiliar with The Gods Must Be Crazy, the premise of it is a Coke bottle falls into a Bushman tribe, and the culture uses it for a bunch of different purposes, but eventually, because there's only one Coke bottle, everyone gets jealous and leads to a bunch of anger and lust, and eventually even violence. So one of the tribesmen decides to take the bottle and try to throw it off the edge of the world. Needless to say, he runs into modern day society and chaos ensues. It is an absolutely wacky premise, but it is rip-roaringly funny. Mm-hmm. I probably would have missed it if it weren't for my brother and my father bringing it up at one point in time and just telling me that I desperately need to see it, and I can totally see why.
It's very witty.
It is really witty. And the interplay with the Bushmen really helps complement the overall motif for cultural communication breaking down as a whole. It is really violent for a comedy, but I have to admit, a lot of it is played for laughs, and I did really love it for that reason.
That's actually a good choice, I have to say.
Honestly, I was actually kind of surprised anyone had seen it. I was kind of 50-50 on that one.
It's really kind of awesome. I did like that. Yeah, I've heard of that.
Number 4 for me is Kelly's Heroes.
Okay, never heard of that one.
I have heard of that.
Really?
I've never seen it, but I've heard of it, yeah.
It is one of the few war comedies that I can honestly say truly does work, even though it is not one bit relevant to the actual war.
Okay.
For anyone who's not familiar with this one as well, I know it's not one that's talked about a whole lot. It is about Private Kelly, who is played here by Clint Eastwood, who's interrogating a Nazi soldier and discovers that there is a bank holding a large amount of gold, and he decides to go AWOL with a special troop to go retrieve it. And the result is absolute hilarity, particularly with Donald Sutherland playing a tank-driving hippie, essentially. It's a quirky movie. It's unexpectedly funny, but it does work really, really well, and it's a very different side from the Clint Eastwood most people will know, playing very gritty characters like Dirty Harry and The Man with No Name. Number 3 for me is Shrek. I thought it's one of the last great family adventure comedy films that wasn't made by Pixar or any other Disney-related company for that matter. The ensemble cast, what can I say, is amazing. Mike Myers and Eddie Murphy, Cameron Diaz as love interest, so on and so forth. Though I have to say, as a kid, even then I thought the potty humor was a bit much at the time.
That's a good choice.
It's a great choice.
Actually, just on a brief side note, what do you think about the second film? Because some people have said they like it better than the first, some people have not.
Honestly, I take the stance that it's probably as good, if not better. I really did enjoy part 2 when I saw it. I've only seen it once. I've seen the first one probably about 4 or 5 times.
I know that the sequels generally, well, some people think they go up and down, but a lot of people seem to go back and forth on the second versus the first.
Is that why you put the first one on instead of the second? You've seen it more?
It's more of an adventure comedy.
That and the fact that I think it's had much more lasting power, because from that we got 3 more sequels. You don't hear a whole lot of people talk about 2 that much, unless they're referring to, okay, here's part 1, here's part 2, which one's better. No one really talks about part 2 as an individual film.
Okay.
That's true.
And number 2 for me is one that we already mentioned, Back to the Future. It's unquestionably one of the best things to have come out of the 80s. Christopher Lloyd, truly at his finest, and Michael J. Fox, what can we say? Great man to play off the madness. Admittedly, none of the sequels ever did match up to the original, but I have to say it is one of the few trilogies that has remained consistently good throughout and providing a great adventure comedy for the whole family.
That holds up, too.
Still holds up, for that matter.
Kids can watch it right now for the first time at age 5 or 6 and love it just as much as I did when I was a kid.
Ironically, for being such a film engrossed in the 80s, it really does have kind of a timelessness to it.
Yeah, it does. I wonder how the second one will hold up, just as an aside, in a few years, because they go to the year 2015 in the second one. So I'm curious to see if that one will still hold, as much water as the first one did. Because, of course, most of the first one takes place in the 50s.
It's true.
Well, for mine, I don't usually do the honorable mentions like you guys do, but this was a very long list for me to cut down. Mm-hmm. Bill and Ted's actually would have been my number 6. I debated very much putting that at my number 5 as well. There's a couple other 80s classics that I do want to mention, and that's Three Amigos and National Lampoon's European Vacation.
Good stuff.
They're not particularly fantastic movies, but they were childhood favorites, and, they're still pretty funny. But my list starts off at number 5 with Tropic Thunder. This was just such a surprise, great movie for me. It was in my top 5 of the year it came out. The 3 leads, Jack Black, Ben Stiller, and Robert Downey Jr. are fantastic, and I would say it's definitely Jack Black's best film, and it's one of the best from Ben Stiller.
I actually really want to give that one a watch at some point, Dan.
Have you not ever seen it?
No, I have seen it. It's just that I'm surprised that you put it so high. See, that's a movie that I've heard a lot of people really liked. I saw it and I thought it was good, but I didn't think it was great. And I would like to revisit it again.
Well, and I think, like I said, it was a huge surprise for me. I mean, I was, looking forward to it. I like the actors in it. But I had no idea it would be just that funny. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe by the time you saw it, it may have been built up a bit. So when you saw it, you were like, I mean, it was okay.
Admittedly, I did not see it in theaters.
Yeah, I saw it like either the first or second week it was out.
Okay,
and
same.
I just loved it. I've seen it probably 3 or 4 times, and it's hilarious every time.
Bet you guessed what the best thing about it for me was?
That the one character was named Al Pacino?
That was one good thing.
Because that's pretty good. Oh, the fake trailers in the beginning?
I did enjoy those as well. They were one of them. Probably Robert Downey Jr.'s character.
Yeah.
That was priceless.
It's other than Iron Man, obviously, it's his finest performance.
Oh, and a decent Matthew McConaughey role, perhaps?
Actually, you know what? Now that you mention it, that was the first Matthew McConaughey movie I saw where I actually was like, okay, this guy is not getting on my nerves.
And once again, he's playing either a lawyer or an agent.
You're absolutely right. I always forget that was really my first turnaround on Matthew McConaughey.
And one more brief note about that movie. Once again, a fantastic performance from Tom Cruise.
As they all are. Tom Cruise really did a great job there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Proving once again that he is very adept at comedy. He doesn't get as much of a chance to show his comedic chops, but he is very funny. My number 4 is Shrek 2.
Oh!
I am a huge Shrek fan. However, my favorite character is Puss in Boots, who doesn't appear till the second movie. So Shrek 2 is my favorite in the entire series.
And the debate continues.
Justin, I applaud your choice of the original Shrek. It is a great movie, and it does set the template for what's to come. But no Puss in Boots equals no top 5 for me. The Goonies is my number 3. Here's a childhood film that holds up just the same as Back to the Future. Kids watch this today for the first time and are as enthralled with it as, we all were in the 80s in my family and all my friends. And it's probably more of an adventure than a comedy. A lot of the ones on this list are pretty well balanced. This definitely has comedic moments, but it's certainly more of an adventure than a comedy, I would say. But the kid actors in this movie are so good, and of course many of them went on to huge successes, including Sean Astin, who even then I had a huge crush on, who grew up to be in Lord of the Rings and all of that, and of course Rudy. But even, the side characters, Martha Plimpton is on Raising Hope now. Corey Feldman was in a lot of great movies from the 80s, and a very young Josh Brolin as well. So if you haven't seen The Goonies in a while, I would recommend going back and giving that another go. My number 2 is Toy Story 3. Now, I always have a bit of a problem ranking these films. This, for me, is the best trilogy of all time. It is the only one that I've ever seen where all 3 movies are A pluses. And I would never begrudge anybody for saying that a different one was their favorite. I always really say that Toy Story 2 is my favorite, but Toy Story 3, in terms of adventure, definitely has it more than any of the others, because they're away from Andy's house pretty much the whole movie. And it's definitely got the comedic chops, and is certainly a great adventure as well. So Toy Story 3 is my number 2.
It's interesting that you chose 3 over the other 2, since I think most people would agree that 3's also probably the most dramatic of the trilogy.
I was actually going to bring that up, that you mentioned 3 as one of your favorite adventure comedies. I will be honest, as a film viewing it, I did not think of it as a comedy.
Really?
It had some funny moments, for sure,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that it might be the most serious and perhaps even the darkest of them.
Oh, well, that's definitely true. That is true. But I think there's darkness in a lot of these movies. I mean, The Goonies certainly has some dark spots.
Mm-hmm. Particularly in a lot of Pixar movies in themselves.
True.
Yeah, when we were sort of making the list and we were rattling off some of the titles, I said Up is a great a great adventure movie, but it really is not a comedy.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I would full-heartedly agree with you. I think it's fairly dramatic, and it is an adventure, lighthearted at points, but it does come up as an adventure comedy.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. I guess maybe it's just how people perceive certain narratives.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of went back and forth on which Toy Story to even put on the list, because like I said, they are all fantastic films. Mm-hmm. I just thought for the adventure portion of the list, it does sort of make the most sense.
Definitely.
But you're right, it's by far the darkest of the 3. Joe, what's your number 1 adventure comedy?
My number 1 adventure comedy is actually one of my favorite comedies of all time, and that is Coming to America. This is honestly one of Eddie Murphy's, if not his best performance. He does multiple performances in this movie, and his writing is excellent as well. Just including the culture shock of this film, as well as the actual initial story of the journey of the characters, and the whole desire of finding love. The romance is actually pretty good in this film. And it's also really awesome because even though it starts out as being both culturally relevant and kind of silly, quirky with some of the deadpan humor, it actually builds up to being really elaborate and quite epic at points. It's just a really, really excellent film. I love it. I watched it with my family growing up. I can watch it anytime. It's a great story about the fish out of water, going to find his roots and explore himself. And it's just really awesome. I really enjoy it.
I'm glad you put that at your number 1. That is one I did not even think of, and that would easily knock Tropic Thunder Out of my number 5 spot, Coming to America is one of the all-time best comedies. It is Eddie Murphy's probably best movie.
It never gets old.
Never gets old. He plays so many great roles. Arsenio Hall plays a few different roles, and he's hysterical.
I want to see him in more stuff. I'm like, where did this guy go? He's so great as his bodyguard. It's just amazing.
Yeah, Arsenio Hall, of course, he kind of gave up the whole acting thing a few years ago. He's got his new talk show now, but I would not mind at all if Arsenio started popping up in movies again.
Great.
He is so funny in Coming to America. That's a great choice for number 1.
Honestly, like, when it just comes to, like, perfect comedies, I can't think of anything else. Just, it's so good. And it's not even really that vulgar.
No, it's language only. I mean, there's a couple bits of nudity as well, but...
briefly, but honestly, for Eddie Murphy, it's pretty tame.
It is. Yeah, for one of Eddie Murphy's R-rated comedies, it is pretty tame.
In the 80s, yeah.
Justin, what's your number 1?
My number one that we also discussed, is Up. Now, I know we had some discussion about Up in terms of actually being an adventure comedy, and I had to take some reflection on that. To be fair, the first 10 to 20 minutes of this movie are incredibly dramatic and very serious and downright heart-wrenching. But the story that follows from that is very comedic in nature, and that's why I think it qualifies as an appropriate adventure comedy. This is probably one of the few films I've seen over the past few years where I was truly blown away by. When I saw the trailers for this, I thought this was completely dead on arrival. I thought this was going to be the one that did Pixar in. And then 3 or 4 weeks after it came out, one of my managers at the time loved it, and he knew I was reviewing movies at the time. And he came up to me and he said, "Justin, you need to see this movie." And I got off work early that day, and I decided to watch it, and it just completely floored me. I describe it to people as this: a marriage of the heart of classic Disney movies with the excitement of almost any Indiana Jones movie, with the exception of the 4th one.
Yes, please don't ever compare Up to the Crystal Skull.
Oh, man.
Alongside that, gorgeous animation with a fantastic concept. They handle really, really mature subject matter maturely and in a way that won't upset family audiences. Even with those first 10 or 20 minutes, I felt like that made it so much more than just a simple adventure comedy. And for that reason alone, I feel it has to be my number 1.
If I had considered Up an adventure comedy, it would certainly make my list. It's among my top 10 movies of all time. It's my favorite Pixar movie, even above all the Toy Stories. And I am with you 100% on that. When I saw the previews, I thought, well, this is it. The streak is over. This looks terrible. Of course, I thought the same with WALL-E, which also turned out to be great. So I thought, okay, I'm a Pixar fan. I gotta at least give it a go. And I fell in love with this movie. It is so good. And I suppose, in hindsight, you're right. It's not really any darker or more or less comedic than Toy Story 3. There are certainly funny parts in it. I guess just in thinking about the list, since we had sort of discussed it beforehand, the dramatic parts far outweigh, I think, the comedic parts in Up, but it is just a fantastic film overall. My number 1 is something that is on both of your lists as well, and that is Back to the Future. I don't need to say a whole lot more than what's already been said. It is just a fantastic movie. It is my number 2 film of all time, and probably always will be, behind The Wizard of Oz. It's just a great movie, and there's another trilogy where all the films are very, very good. They're certainly not all A-pluses like the Toy Story franchise, but the first one certainly is far and above the best. All right, good top 5, guys. That was a fun topic.
Great one.
All right, well, let's get into our triple feature this week, and if you're unfamiliar, what we do is watch 3 movies every week in 3 separate categories. The first is our new classic, which is a film previously seen and highly rated by Justin and I, and sometimes Joe has seen them before, sometimes he has not, but it's a film that's come out within the last 2 years. Then we have our old classic, which is chosen by one of us or by a member of our friends group that comes and joins us on Tuesdays. And then our third one is the Oscar A to Z, and we're taking a look at all of the Oscar-nominated films of all time, and at least in the major categories, and looking at them alphabetically. So that's how the triple feature works. And this week, our new classic is one that just made the cut. It was released 2 years ago on the weekend that we watched it, and that is Margin Call. And Justin's going to tell us about that.
Okay, so after getting fired, Eric Dale, played by Stanley Tucci, gives his protege, Peter Sullivan, played by Zachary Quinto, who most people know from Star Trek, a document containing his recent research that could predict an impending financial crisis. Now, with Dale gone and no way to contact him, Sullivan is sent out to try and find him in hopes of finding some way for the company to cut its losses before it's too late. One of the best things about Margin Call is that it does not hold back the blame for the reckless actions of these people. In the 80s, Gordon Gekko said, "Greed is good," but this movie proves that in this day and age, that just can't be the case. The result is a realistic and often infuriating depiction of the moments leading up to the 2000 to 2008 recession from the perspective of the perpetrators themselves, Wall Street bankers. Part of the reason this works as well as it does is largely due to a fantastic ensemble, which includes Kevin Spacey, Demi Moore, and Jeremy Irons, but remarkable cinematography as well, particularly in how they use lighting to capture nightlife and give a feeling that at the bank, everyone is under scrutiny. My only real major complaint about this movie comes from the fact that I wish it hadn't dragged in a few spots. Although, with that said, Margin Call is still a very well-constructed, character-driven drama that I can completely recommend, and I give it a B.
Yeah, here's an example of a film where, much like The Fifth Estate, I don't necessarily care about the subject matter, but unlike that film, the plot and the people involved here are so interesting that I really did become invested, no pun intended. It's no surprise that Spacey gives a first-rate performance, he always does, but you're absolutely right, the ensemble is really good overall, and just about everybody gives a powerful performance here. Right from the opening scene in which Stanley Tucci gets fired unceremoniously, I became interested in the ins and outs of the investment banking, but also the characters intertwined within it and the consequences for each of them as the tension starts to build up. Now, this film was actually nominated at the Oscars for Best Original Screenplay, which is a testament to how well these characters are written, considering it's a movie that pretty much nobody saw. Some characters might have been a little better developed, and as a first-time director, J.C. Chandor, who also wrote the screenplay, was a little more shaky behind the camera as he was on paper. But all in all, this is a very good film, and I can recommend it as well. Margin Call gets a B from me also. Joe?
Margin Call follows basically subject matter that I will admit, though it's relevant, I'm not particularly interested in the specific details. However, I think the film does a really good job of executing that, primarily through the characters being really well written and the performances of the actors. I mean, the acting in this film was really, really good.
So good.
As was the cinematography and the direction. Really just the pacing of the screenplay was really, really good. We got invested in what was going on, as you said before, and it really, really is good. I mean, there aren't any particular major issues with the movie. However, I do agree with Justin. It did kind of drag at some spots, and I kind of wish it would have elaborated a little bit more on the specifics of how this event actually occurred. I don't think it went too in-depth.
Yeah, it sort of started as it was already falling apart. You're right.
And I kind of was really interested in seeing that this was kind of focusing on such a big deal that happened in recent memory, and I thought it would really been interesting to show kind of the specifics on how it happened, but really kind of focus more on the characters and how vile some of these people really were, which did work, but I kind of felt that they could have dealt with the matter a little more succinctly. Still, the performances really, really held it up. Overall, I'd say it was a good, solid movie. Really no particular problems. But beyond that, I don't think it really wowed me in a particular way. Still, I would recommend it, and I also would give it a solid B.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, there are people in this film doing completely unscrupulous things, but some of them aren't necessarily bad people. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting, especially in Kevin Spacey's character, to see, here's a firm that he's worked for, I forget what he says in the movie, something like 30-some years.
Long time.
So he's seen a lot of these recessions, and he's seen things come and go, and he says at one point to Zachary Quinto's character, it's happened before, it'll happen again. But he really sort of, at the same time, becomes this fatherly kind of figure to his character, who's really just starting out in the business. This is Zachary Quinto's character I'm talking about. And he's at the head of this, and by the end of the movie, he is questioning everything that he's been a part of. I don't want to give too much away, but it's some really, really great writing. with the character development. And when I was looking at it earlier today about the film itself, I was not surprised that it was nominated for an original screenplay.
That's really a great combination, just the solid writing for the characters and the performers, because it really brings about this really human element, which I enjoy, but it also really captures how dark and twisted these situations can make people.
Right.
And I think that was best exemplified by Jeremy Irons, when he's kind of holding that one conversation.
Boy, he was great.
I mean, as just the evil corporate businessman who honestly thinks that everything's okay.
Right.
And I believe he says something similar, basically, there'll be recessions and whatnot, but it doesn't matter because we just come up on top and start all over again. Even though he's ruining thousands of people's lives, it doesn't matter to him. It's just the way it is.
It doesn't faze him.
Not at all. It's just business as usual.
Yeah. Well, up next, we've got the inspiration for this week's Top 5 Adventure Comedies, and that is Without a Paddle, which was brought to us by friend of the show, Jess. Paddle centers around 3 childhood friends, played by Seth Green, Matthew Lillard, and Dax Shepard, who reunite after another of their friends passes. They find a treasure chest and map while talking about old memories in their former treehouse, and decide to go on a camping trip to find the treasure. Hilarity does actually ensue here, and what could have been a completely generic, unfunny quest becomes enjoyable and even a little heartfelt, thanks to great chemistry between the 3 likable leads and some original situations, like stumbling upon a marijuana farm and being chased for the remainder of the film by 2 violent pot farmers, in addition to having to fight off all the usual elements. The last few scenes with Burt Reynolds were a bit of a miss, even though I do like him, and the schmaltzy end, though probably necessary, didn't affect me like I think it was supposed to. But overall, I liked it. I'm not completely surprised that I enjoyed the movie because I do like all 3 of the main actors, but I wasn't sure that I would enjoy it quite this much when I found out that this was our movie. I had not seen it before, like you guys had, and Without a Paddle scores a B+ from me. Joe?
This movie is one that I have seen several times, and I will admit it does strike kind of a personal chord with me. Being someone that grew up scouting and going out camping and hiking, I really liked the theme of this movie and where it took place. It's also kind of a parody of a movie that I watched when I was young called Deliverance, a much darker film, which I think is kind of hilarious in of itself. But the film itself also stars Seth Green, just a guy that, as an actor and as a person, I just love everything he does, and I think he does a great job in this film, as do the other actors. And I think the characters were also fairly well written, and yes, the theme of the movie is kind of cheesy, but it's a good, heartfelt idea, and I think the chemistry, as you said, really, really helps that through. There are some kind of ridiculous antics, but for the most part, it draws a lot of laughs. I don't think that I was unamused throughout the entire movie. The Burt Reynolds part, yes, it's a bit off, but the fact that he's Burt Reynolds and he's awesome.
It's pretty awesome.
Also kind of paying homage to Deliverance, since he was in that film.
Yep.
I think was a pretty cool nod to that. It really has a great pace, it has some great shots, and the humor is pretty good for the most part, and I really, really enjoyed it. I would love to see it again. I give it a B+ as well.
Awesome. Justin?
This is a guilty pleasure movie in the very sense of the word.
Yep.
While the humor is occasionally dumb and kind of hit or miss, I have to say I was surprised at how effective it was with the comedy. This is largely thanks to the great comedic timing between Seth Green and Dax Shepard, with Matthew Lillard essentially serving as the moderator between the two. Whether or not audiences will find any humor in it will depend largely on one's own suspension of disbelief, but I do have to confess I did find this to be a very fun adventure comedy. It's nothing particularly special. I do see what you mean completely, Dan, with the kind of schmaltzy ending. I thought the Burt Reynolds thing was okay. I didn't have as much of an issue with it as you did. But for those willing to let it in, I really do think there's some good laughter to be had. And I leave Without a Paddle with a B.
Understand, I don't necessarily have a problem with the Burt Reynolds scene, but it is like one of the things from the movie that detracts it from getting like an A-. Like Joe said, it's just a little bit off.
The tone's a little
seems
off.
kind of out of place with the rest of the movie.
Though, it does tie in well with the plot.
Yeah, it does. He's a good plot point in the film, but the way it was executed was a little bit off for me. But here's a movie where these 3 actors are so likable on screen. I don't know if they were friends before this movie or what, but their chemistry is great.
I think they were.
And it's one of the examples where they're actually having as much fun on screen as we are watching them. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of movies like this, and I could name maybe the Hangover series in that pantheon, where the actors on screen seem to be having much more of a good time. Actually, Grown Ups is probably a better example. In the Grown Ups films, the guys are having such a blast, but I'm not having as much fun watching them. And without a paddle, I feel like I was on the ride with them, and I was having just as much fun as they were. Would you guys agree with that?
That sounds about right.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's move on to our final film, and that is Adaptation. Now, alphabetically, if you're keeping track, next in our Oscar nominees was supposed to be the 1949 comedy Adam's Rib. We had some technical difficulties trying to stream it, however, so we went to the next film in the list, and I now have Adam's Rib on DVD, so we will be able to watch that without issue for our next podcast, and I'm sure this probably won't be the first time that something like this is going to happen. So we went to the next movie on the list, which is Adaptation. Now, believe it or not, that with over 80 years of Academy Awards, this is already the third movie from 2002 that we've been talking about in just 9 weeks. We had About a Boy and About Schmidt, and now it's Adaptation. This was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Actor for Nicolas Cage, Best Supporting Actress for Meryl Streep. It won Chris Cooper a Supporting Actor Oscar, and for the first time ever, a fictitious person was nominated for Screenplay, as the fictional Donald Kaufman was nominated alongside his brother, Charlie Kaufman, a real person. Now, both are played in the film by Nick Cage. Are you confused yet? This is basically a semi-autobiographical film based on a non-fiction book called The Orchid Thief, written by Susan Orlean, played by Meryl Streep, and Kaufman's attempt to turn The Orchid Thief into a film, while paralleling the book's plot in the subplot of Adaptation. Now, thrown in are plenty of fictitious events also, for example, the aforementioned fictional Kaufman brother, and a romance story between Streep and Chris Cooper's character. And by the end of the film, the movie loses its biographical stance and turns completely to fiction. Spike Jonze directs, and as per usual, you probably figured it out, this is not an ordinary movie in any sense of the word. Joe?
The word I'm going to go for is original. This movie really speaks to me personally, and I think that's because I know what it's like to write and struggle as a writer, and I think that's one of the themes of the film, though it has many, many layers, and that's just evident even by the basic synopsis, which
Yeah.
Dan was nice enough to actually do for me, because I really just didn't want to take the time to do that, because I kind of do last-minute things anyway. So, thank you, Dan.
Try and figure it all out.
Try and figure it out, and I'm glad you did that, Dan.
Yeah, no problem.
Honestly, I really did like this movie. I'd seen a little bit once before. I guess I didn't see the whole film. Maybe it was on TV or something. But seeing it whole for once this time actually was quite beneficial. I liked certain things in the movie. I liked this kind of semi-autobiographical exploration of Kaufman's life and his struggles as a writer, and how it just kind of deviated this struggle of a screenwriter trying to adapt something which is virtually impossible for him. And we really see, I think, greatly through Nicolas Cage's performance, how difficult a struggle it is. And Nicolas Cage playing 2 different characters, I think kind of is one of those rare instances where we see him actually having some real acting chops. He does a really great job in this film. We see this individual who's really likable, and he's struggling not only as a writer, but also to kind of connect with other people. I think Meryl Streep does a great job, and I think Chris Cooper, who honestly is kind of an underrated actor, I'm glad that I got a nomination and a win for this one, because I think he deserves a lot more. This movie is a character study. It's a study on writing. It's a study on adapting something and trying to be true to it while trying to add some more spice. And that speaks to the real-life events of the characters, but is also interplayed by the various allegories and different shifting of tone and events throughout the film, and the slow build to ultimate fiction, which is kind of mirroring with Nicolas Cage's character's struggle that he discusses in the film. So, on multiple levels, this screenplay is talking about screenplays, and it's trying to focus on all these thematic concepts about just kind of struggling to find something meaningful in your life through Meryl Streep's character as she is interviewing this Orchid Thief, which is a book that I'm going to have to read at some point because it sounds fascinating. You know, and admittedly, you're also having the connection that Charlie Kaufman is seeing while he's reading this book, and that's why he wants to create such a film that has that ultimate meaning, but it's so impossible. And I'm kind of rambling talking about it because it's a film that kind of rambles, but it just has so many layers, and it's just so intricate, and I think it's all tied together by really good performances, specifically by Nicolas Cage. He does a great job, and I will admit this film is weird. It's not for everybody, and it's definitely going to require multiple viewings and some thought, honestly, but I think it's a powerful film. I think it's an interesting film. I honestly really liked it. I'm going to give it a B+.
Well, I have to completely echo Joe on the fact that if there's one thing that can truly be said about adaptation, is that this movie is fiendishly original. So much so that one could argue it's almost too much for its own good. But I'm going to come back to that. Nicolas Cage delivers one of his best performances as the writer's block-ridden real-life screenwriter Charlie Kaufman and his hilarious, quote, brother, Donald, who seems to have all of his thoughts together. The sheer interplay between these two roles played by Nicolas Cage in a single given scene, along with many others, is reason enough to see this, but how they string together a concept this unique and this bizarre is even more impressive. However, the problem with this is that for some, this is going to get very overwhelming. Adaptation throws a great deal of material at the screen, and while much of it is necessary and needed, and it does complement the story, it also can get slightly off-putting. I can pretty much guarantee the humor, people are either going to get it or is going to completely fly past them. That said, given my own personal experiences, both as a screenwriter and with writer's block, these themes hit home, and the result manages to be both hilarious and sort of self-loathing at the same time.
I can agree with you there.
Adaptation will not be everyone's favorite Oscar nominee, but I am very, very glad that I had an opportunity to rewatch this, and I give it a very well-deserved B.
I'm not a Nicolas Cage fan. I don't think that's a secret. I like him very selectively. His best movies for me are his comedies and his dramas. I hate his action movies. But this is a mixture of both comedy and drama with a definite lean towards the drama. And though it's probably not my favorite of his performances, it's definitely on the far above average side. He actually plays off himself very well, like Joe mentioned, and I think that's one of the movie's strongest points. Spike Jonze gives us a full visual spectacle like he usually does, and he tries to make the most sense of a very confusing story. Until reading up on this film after we watched it, I wasn't quite sure what was real and what wasn't. I didn't even realize The Orchid Thief was a real book. I knew Charlie Kaufman was a real person, but I did know that the end of the film turned something already hard to follow into something you almost need a diagram for. It's not bad necessarily, and like Joe said, it does sort of fit in with the mentality of the Charlie character, but it also doesn't fit that well with the tone of the first 2/3 of the movie, and that's a bit jarring, like you guys both mentioned, to some viewers. I was a little bit put off by it, but I understood that this is sort of a reflection of where the character is going. It's a great cast, like you said, Joe, proven by all the film's acting nods. I mean, that was almost all of its nominations in acting. And they really help propel a tough script. Spike Jonze is one of my favorite directors on the quirky side of things. I love Where the Wild Things Are. I love a lot of his music video work. One of the first times I ever heard of him was with the Beastie Boys Sabotage video, which, if you've never seen it, hopefully it's on YouTube or something. It's a fantastic video.
It's a bit trippy.
He's trippy, and in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sometimes I can't get behind the weird for weird's sake sort of thing that we see, like with Wes Anderson sometimes, just for example. But I think Spike Jonze really did a lot to propel this movie to something a little more quirky, made more, I don't want to say mainstream, because it's certainly not a mainstream film, but I don't know, maybe something more relatable.
I would think relatable,
because you guys both hit on the fact that you can relate to the character, and I think that's sort of aided by Jones's directing. I leave adaptation with a solid B as well, but with the caveat that, like Joe said, I think it probably would benefit from repeat viewings, and I can see seeing this movie maybe, a second or even a third time, sinking my teeth into it a little bit more, and going into it knowing what to expect. I could see it moving up the grade scale a little bit to a B+ or higher. And certainly, after the last movie we saw for the Oscars, which was Action in the North Atlantic, this was such a welcome change of pace, and I would say the most original of any of the Oscar nominees we've seen so far.
It's very stimulating.
It is very stimulating, and it's one that you really need to pay attention to. You can't go into this movie with your brain half on something else. You need to pay full attention, especially kind of when it hits like the halfway point and things start getting a little bit murky between what's fact and what's fiction. But I thought it was a very good movie. And this is not one that I was looking forward to seeing because of my history with Nicolas Cage. But I'm definitely glad that we watched it.
Definitely. It's a good one. Very good one.
All right. Well, that is going to wrap up our show for this week. We thank you so much for listening. Next week, like I said, we'll have Adam's Rib in our Oscar A to Z, which I am also looking forward to watching. I've heard good things. It's one of the most classic comedies ever, so we'll check that out. And in addition, talk about some other great movies, including a top 5 Marvel films, which should be interesting and a bit stimulating. You can catch Joe's YouTube page, which is Merlin Boss. Anything new on there, Joe?
Well, I changed my name.
Oh, okay.
I'm Merlin the Mighty now.
Okay, so people can look you up that way.
That's true. I did put up a few new videos, some thoughts on The Walking Dead current season. I finally checked out Arrow, gave some first impressions on the first episode, and the most recent Dragon Ball Z film I did a review of.
And that's under Merlin the Mighty.
Now it is.
On YouTube. And of course, you can check out Film Fanatics on YouTube. All of our previous episodes are up. You can subscribe to us, like the podcast, whatever you want to do. We've also got our Facebook group, Film Fanatics with an exclamation point, and our Twitter account as well, which is at Film Fanatics Pod. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back here next time. Bye!